the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad, and then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortunate he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد عاشبني ويجاهد عاش بكفاحه الخالد راجل واحد مبدأ واحد
عاش جيل ثورتنا
عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار عاش الجندي يوم ما حطم شوكة الاستعمار كان عنوان النصر الثوري في كل بلد أحرار وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية باسم مبادئ أبية
أنا خط هجوم ودفاع أنا رمز سلام وصراع أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع أنا خط هجوم ودفاع أنا رمز سلام وصراع أفدي بالروح وأعيش في النصر بطل وشجاع حيوا معايا قولوا معايا بنورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. عاش الزرع يوم الشمس ما حست بيها عليه. فرش بنورها وكبر الزرع وهو مداري عليه. وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
وسمعناه بيقولها قوية أرض ولادي ورجعت ليا.
حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حرمونا سنين وسنين وافتكروا الناس نايمين وطلعنا عليهم يوم خلصنا حقهم ملايين. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش فلاح الثورة
عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان. يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. عاش الفن حضارة الأمة يبنيها الفنان. يروى حياتها في غنوة في كلمة في صورة بروح وإيمان. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية مجد بلادي عهد عليا.
قلبي وروحي ملك الفني والاتنين لبلادي هدية. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الفن رسالة عاش.
عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. عاش العامل يوم ما فكر يبني البلد ودار فيها مداخن طالع منها لهب النور والنار. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية ده إنتاجي وصنع إيديا.
حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. حققنا بعون الله للشعب دعاه ومنى والخير زاد منا وفاض والفايض صدرناه. قولوا معايا حيوا معايا
عاش عاش العامل عاش.
عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح. عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. عاش الطالب يوم ما طلب العلم كتاب وسلاح. عارف العلم وسيلة تحقق غاية كل نجاح. وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
وسمعنا بيقولها قوية في الإعداد وفي الكلية.
العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. العلم سلاح جبار بيحول ليلنا نهار يسعى للنور بالنور ويواجه النار بالنار. حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش الجيل الصاعد عاش.
عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. عاش الشعب العربي كله شعب سلام وأمان. عاش الوعي العربي كله ثورة في كل مكان. ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ثورة مارد للحرية هب ونادى بالقومية.
ردينا عليك يا جمال وايدينا في ايديك يا جمال وطلعنا معاك يا جمال نبني وياك يا جمال. ردينا عليك
يا جمال
وايدينا في ايديك
يا جمال
وطلعنا وطلعنا معاك
يا جمال
نبني وياك يا جمال حيوا معايا قولوا معايا
عاش عبد الناصر عاش
Небо утреннего стяг, в жизни важен первый шаг. Слышишь, реют над страною ветры яростных атак. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. И Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Весть летит во все концы, вы поверьте нам, отцы, будут новые победы, станут новые бойцы.
продолжает собой, и сердцу тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди.
С неба милости не жди, жизнь для правды не щади. Нам, ребята, в этой жизни только с правдой по пути.
И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Ленин такой молодой, и юный октябрь впереди. Не стой, снегопад, не ветер, не вода. Знамени планеты, наш всемирный твой отряд. И вновь продолжает собой, и сердце тревожно в груди.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the 5th of February 2024, and we are here today to answer a question that was posed last night with regard to imperialism and whether Russia is an imperialist power or not, and that's going to be the basis for our discussion today. And I think that's a very interesting topic. It's one that I've explored before, but I remember that I did it principally in different formats, so probably best that I go over this in this format. And of course, my reading and research on the subject always continues, so there's always something new to bring to it. So that's going to be the principal subject of discussion for the next 90 minutes or so. Always, as ever, feel free to add your own questions and discussion points as we go along. First of all, though, we will greet those who have popped up in the chat so far. If you haven't done so already, be sure to like and share the stream, and that will always be helpful in terms of boosting the numbers and, of course, getting around the inevitable YouTube censorship that occurs. Now, in the event that, of course, all communists are removed from YouTube in some sort of Elon Musk-inspired, conspiracy purge thing, I have the backup platforms on Odyssey and Rumble. The Odyssey one is particularly amusing because it's the chat's always filled with anti-communists saying, "Oh my God, commie bastard," which is hilarious. So we will proceed, and I'll say hello to Muzzlepaint, who's in the chat. Good evening to you. Munis, hello. Jenny, good evening, comrades. Exactly. Gonzalo, good evening. RVA Klavic, good evening. And Oz, hope all's well with you as well. Martin, hello to you. Adam Marks, greetings. Hendrik, hello to you. Roddy, good evening to you. Tobias Heinemann, hello and good evening. Sammy says, greetings, comrades. Not often to get to a live stream, but try and listen to every single recording. Well, glad you could be with us. Battle Cossacks, saludos. Right, okay. We begin by asking the question, which, of course, very few people actually on the left in Britain bothered to, which is, of course, what constitutes imperialism? Because the war between the Russian Federation and US imperialism and its bloc of allies in the form of the NATO alliance, which is taking place in Ukraine, was dismissed by most of the British left as an inter-imperialist war. They never sought to explore the reasons behind the war or never seriously interrogated the nature of the modern Russian economy and state. And it is a consideration of this that we will be carrying out today. So let's first of all start off with the question of what constitutes imperialism according to the classic definition laid down by Lenin. There are, of course, additions to this. Further work was done by Stalin and Mao in their additions to Marxist-Leninism. And, of course, you got other additions from the likes of Samir Amin and other Marxist and communist writers and economists who came later in the 20th century. And, of course, you then have to include the analysis of people like Kwame Nkrumah in looking at this in terms of his work developing the theory of and the study of neo-colonialism. But by going back to Lenin's work, we start with the basic premises of what constitutes imperialism, and these still hold to this day. Now, according to Lenin, imperialism it consists of a move within capitalist countries in the later 19th century that sees the merger of money capital and industrial capital into a new form that is Lenin calls finance capital. Of course, he was taking some of the work that had been done by previous studies, for instance, by Rudolf Hilferding, and adding to it. If you notice that in Lenin's work on imperialism, he quotes extensively from Rudolf Hilferding and J.A. Hobson, an English liberal writer, who developed some interesting theories on imperialism that Lenin drew on and built upon. So Lenin identifies this merger of money and industrial capital into finance capitalism, and of course its merger with, more or less, with the state machine as being the foundation for imperialism. And now, why does this occur? This occurs in all of the major capitalist nations: Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Germany, to a slightly lesser extent, but still a very bloody extent, Italy, and of course the United States itself. Portugal and Spain are a bit of an interesting case because they, of course, are imperialist powers, but their empires stem from a much earlier period, the peak of their powers being 14th, 15th, 16th, and to a certain extent 17th century, then the rapid decline in the 18th. And the failure of the feudal rulers of Portugal and Spain to actually invest the gigantic amount of plunder that they got from the New World caused the decline and fall of those particular empires. But that's another story. What we're here today to talk about is the emergence of imperialism. Now, I'm going to be using, for the benefit of the analysis here, the examples mostly of Britain, because this is the oldest continually existing capitalist nation. And of course, it is the one that went into the imperialist period before anybody else. And now, why does that happen? Now, we have talked about before the reasons for the relative decline of the British industrial base. Now, this occurs in arguable terms. There's many arguments about when this occurs exactly. My argument is that the decline in British manufacturing actually starts in the 1850s. British manufacturing had been so far ahead of the curve in terms of its rapid development throughout the 18th and into the 19th century. It had rapidly evolved away from workshop and artisan early capitalist production, but that rapid turn to greater levels of artisan production in the later 16th and early 17th century had been a major factor in the contradictions that built up and could only be resolved by the English Civil War and Revolution. So by the time you get the coming to power and the crowning of James I and VI of Scotland in England, or the Union of England and Scotland, in 1603, you have already a very extensive early capitalist system in Britain. It's a capitalist system based on, in terms of its industrial production, workshops which are still to a large extent run on the old guild basis, but starting to change. You also have new agricultural methods that are being practiced in the countryside that have been brought in over the previous 100 to 150 years since the breakup of the monasteries and the selling off of the land to a new layer of landowners who were working the land in new and more effective and more productive ways than the old aristocracy. In fact, by the 17th century in England especially, the old aristocracy is looking distinctly, if not impoverished, then its agricultural methods are outdated. It's having to take a lot of loans from the new bankers and merchants who, of course, making a lot of money in what's now known as the City of London. So Britain, really back then, England, the Union of England and Scotland, the Union of the Crowns that first exists in the 17th century and is confirmed later on in a formal contract, shall we say, in the 18th century. So Britain's the oldest continually existing capitalist nation. And so it goes through this rapid evolution that, first of all, causes its civil war and revolution. And it's by far and away the most industrially developed by the time, of course, of the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. And it also has, dating from the later 16th century, an increasingly extensive network of colonial possessions, which of course it ruthlessly hyper-exploits. And of course it's got extensive holdings in the what you might call the slave industry. Britain being one of the biggest and most rapacious slave trading countries. It, of course, then pulls out of the slave trade later on and claims a great moral victory. They're still trying to dine out of that to this day, but of course they'd had over 200 years of slave trading and profiting very handsomely from it beforehand. So this is my way of getting to the point about the decline of British industrial manufacturing. Now, because they've been so far ahead for so long, they've been miles ahead of their nearest competitor, which at the time was the French, and they stayed ahead thanks to the disruption in the French industrial development caused by the disastrous defeat in the end of Napoleon Bonaparte, the very corrupt and very inefficient monarchies of the houses of Bourbon and Savoy, which rule up to 1848, and then again with the shall we say, erratic rule of Napoleon III, who lent in various different directions according to who he needed to, shall we say, placate or crack down upon at any given moment. And he favoured the financial sector often over the industrial sector, and favoured the richer peasantry over the more efficient forms of agriculture. So Britain is the most successful early on because it has all of these advantages. It did all of the things that it needed to do over a course of many hundreds of years in terms of making it the leading capitalist power. However, you can see that it starts to get outstripped by the 1850s, and it's getting outstripped principally by the United States. In terms of, as we've mentioned before, the United States' revolution in its ability to produce more efficient means of production than the British could. So the British, particularly after the American Civil War, do certain things to expand their empire. And they expand their empire because what's happening is that the British ruling class are starting to refuse to invest or not invest inside Britain itself. What they're doing is they're exporting their capital. And this is where we get back to Lenin's point about the principal exports of the imperialist countries not being commodities anymore, but being capital. So what they're doing is they're, rather than investing in Britain and investing in new means of production, British industry is actually declining measurably. You can measure this from the 1860s onwards. And you get to, of course, through this period, you have the unification of Germany and the unification of Italy to a slightly less important extent. But Germany unifies, especially, of course, finally finishing off that process with the defeat of France in the Franco-Prussian War. And then you get a rapid development of German industry to outstrip, again, Britain in terms of industrial production. Now, of course, both in terms of the United States and Germany, British capitalists had actually been big investors in both. So they actually ended up funding the development of their own competitors. So the British from the 1860s are acquiring or asserting control over more and more territories directly. Now, this, of course, gives us the famous pink maps of places like Africa in the 1870s and 1880s, 1890s, and you get the agreement upon the division of Africa between the major European powers after what was known as the Scramble for Africa in the 1880s. Now, one of the reasons why we get, of course, World War I is because that Britain has been at the colonial game longer than the Germans have. And the Germans are late to the party in terms of industrial development, but do so very, very rapidly. So over the course of 25 years, they reach the point where they enter the imperialist period as well, as chronicled by Lenin in his work. So by the time you get to the turn of the century, you can see a similar process going on in Germany as was going on in Britain, which is the merger of money and industrial capital to create finance capital, the building up of cartels, as Lenin referred to them, or monopolies, in covering various different industries, and the creation of these giant financial capitalist companies that were, of course, effectively merged with the state in many different countries. And of course this happens in Germany slightly later, and of course the British and the French have already divided up most of the territories of the world between them. So German imperialism comes late to this, and when it needs to start sending its capital overseas, it is limited in what it can do. It has Namibia in a very brutal fashion, by the way, that is often neglected by even people on the supposedly anti-imperialist left. But as the Namibian government pointed out recently, the Germans carried out a mass murder campaign there just before World War I that killed over 1 million people in what's now Namibia. But point is, they're limited in terms of their colonial possessions. They have Namibia, they have Cameroon, they have some of the area that's now known as Tanzania. They have, if I'm remembering this rightly, they have Papua New Guinea and a few other islands in the Pacific area, and some trade concessions in China. Someone, I'm sure, will point out exactly where. I've forgotten the name of the area that they had in China, but they lost those rapidly in World War I anyway. So this is part of what causes World War I, a big part, which is, of course, colonial rivalry. But it's not just, rivalry over who gets to stick a flag in a particular piece of land. It's not just a rivalry between Union Jacks and the flag of the Kaiserreich. It's a question of who gets to actually make the most capital back, and then we get the biggest return on their investments by being able to hyper-exploit these territories. And I would be neglectful in doing this presentation if I didn't, of course, mention the hideous crimes of King Leopold and the Belgians in the Congo. But again, like that was exposed partly by an Irishman who at the time worked for the British Foreign Office, a guy called Roger Casement, who would later be involved in the Easter Rising and in the bid to try and secure weaponry from the Kaiser, was found out, busted, and ended up being hanged for his convictions. A great man and a great Irish patriot, though, it must be said, as we're on the subject. But so this is the high colonial period, or the early colonial period. It leads, of course, to two things. Massive export of capital, Britain becoming more and more reliant upon export of capital. Its domestic industries start declining. Why? Because the ruling class are refusing to invest in them. As Lenin chronicles via his interrogation of the work of J.A. Hobson, you see the decline, not just the decline of British industry, but active deindustrialization before 1914. Lenin observes that the south coast of Britain, and particularly in an area like Kent, is already being turned into a resort, a playground for the rich. And that's because the capital is all going to the colonized areas of the world, because those nations and peoples that are occupied by the British can be hyper-exploited in a brutal fashion, often with less of an investment in means of production in doing so. You don't have to remember the discussion that we've had before about the way in which the capitalist class invests in new means of production, gains a temporary advantage in terms of a boost in productivity and profit, but then you get monopolization, overproduction, and back to crisis again. So what you find often in the imperialist period is that the imperialist powers, and I'll use the example of Britain again, are very keen on exporting their capital because they actually have to invest less in means of production in the colonized nations than they would inside Britain. To make investment efficient and to pay you back at a sufficient quality and a sufficient level inside Britain, you need to invest very heavily in means of production. You need, if you're running a mill or running a mine, for instance, or you're running a steelworks in Britain in 1901, you would need to invest an awful lot in your steelworks in order to make your steel efficient in terms of its product. That you need to secure a high productivity of labor to be able to compete with the growing strength of German steel and US steel in particular. US steel, of course, being also a famous brand name later on. But the reason why, of course, they become so keen on investing capital overseas is, particularly if you're extracting raw resources. So, for instance, if you're employing black South Africans to mine gold or diamonds or later on platinum in southern Africa, you don't have to invest as much in means of production. Why? You can employ far more laborers at a much, much lower rate of pay in order to extract those diamonds. You can also, of course, because they're a colonized people and subject and have zero political rights under your system. There was, of course, an argument over the fact that the British supposedly had extended certain political rights to certain of the tribal groups in occupied South Africa, but that didn't stop them brutally hyper-exploiting black African labor. The point is that because of these circumstances, that the favorable circumstances that colonization gives you, you do not have to invest anything like the same level in the means of production, or particularly the means of extraction, in the African nations, in British-occupied India and other places. You can use lower forms of means of production, but you can use a much higher amount of labor, because that labor is currently, in this early stage, unorganized, and you have it under a regime of political terror, which, due to working class resistance domestically, you no longer can do. So you can get a much, much more, a higher rate of return in the colonies on a lower investment in means of production than you can at home. From the point of view of a capitalist, that's an absolute no-brainer. That's an absolute no-brainer. You invest in South Africa. You don't invest in Kent anymore. You invest in mines in South Africa. You invest in, of course, cotton production in India, though, of course, you take care to cripple the ability of the Indians to maintain that industry. You make sure that you keep the production there at a not very advanced level to ensure that you take the resource back to Britain to do the finishing off. It's a consistent theme of imperialism that they kept these countries at a lower level of development because they wanted to keep them as places of raw resource extraction. So that is my way of sort of explaining why imperialism behaves in the way that it does. It is an inevitable development of capitalism in the 19th century, and the imperialist powers from that period, largely, though with a couple of additions, are of course still the major imperialist powers today. So this is the necessary background to consider what the question of whether the current Russian Federation is imperialist. So first of all, let us consider the question of what constitutes, how is Russian capitalism in this current era constituted? Now, to understand this, of course, we have to go back to the early 1990s and the counter-revolution and forced implosion of the Soviet Union. Now, what happened immediately after that is that power passes into the hands of a group of what is best described as comprador scum in Russia, headed, of course, by Yeltsin. Not that he was making too many decisions. He was principally the sort of puppet, partly of U.S. imperialism and the domestic compradors, organized around political figures such as Anatoly Chubais, Yegor Gaidar, and others, who, and of course, Putin's old friend, the former mayor of Leningrad, Anatoly Sobchak. So these figures represented the complete comprador bourgeoisie, the people who weren't interested in investing in anything. They just wanted to asset strip Russia, steal everything that wasn't nailed down. Russia got significantly deindustrialized all the way through the 1990s and even into the 2000s. And what was being done, of course, was a plan really cooked up by imperialism, US imperialism and British imperialism, in collaboration with the domestic compradors, which is that, to use the memorable phrase of the late and unlamented Senator John McCain, Russia is a gas station run by a dictator. Not so much expressing the reality of Russia when he said that in the mid-2000s, but expressing a wish of US imperialism, of which, of course, McCain was a devoted servant for his entire life. Now, what was being constructed, or what was trying to be constructed in the period of the 1990s, was a system whereby Russia would have its industrial base annihilated. And that's a quite deliberate strategy on behalf of people like Gaidar and Chubais and Sobchak, because what they wanted to do was, of course, turn Russia into just a supplier of principally oil and gas, though, of course, there are other natural resources that come out of Russia, such as, of course, uranium, which, of course, is still, or until very recently, was being exported to the United States, even under sanctions. So oil, gas, uranium. There's significant platinum deposits, I believe, in Russia. It's a significant producer of aluminium as well, but principally oil and gas. Those are the two things that the comprador bourgeois were heavily invested in to a degree. And the way in which the US imperialists saw this was that, well, we will have Russia under control. We'll have it under the control of, well, if not Yeltsin, he's a bit embarrassing and perhaps a bit erratic, somebody who's a bit more sober, somebody who can put a better face on this. And the same is true, by the way, for the oil-rich countries of the Caucasus and Central Asia. So Azerbaijan, for instance, run by a comprador family clique, the Aliyev family, or the Aliyev crime family, who have been agents principally for British imperialism since the early 1990s. Though, of course, Erdogan has muscled his way in here with these sort of bizarre and crazed idea for some sort of pan-Turkic federation, which I don't think he's ever going to come off. But it's the British who are the principal backers of the Aliyev regime, not Erdogan. He's involved there, but the British have been in there for over 30 years. Same thing with the Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, places like that, with anywhere with significant oil and gas deposits. These were meant to be integrated into the global imperialist system as run principally by the United States, with, of course, the able assistance of the British. And they were meant to supply the imperialist world with the raw resources that would be extracted from there. Now, herein we get to some interesting quirks to the story, because what the British and the Americans were aiming at in the 90s was that the Russians wouldn't control anything. Yeah, you would have Russian workers extracting this stuff from the ground, but the whole process, what they wanted was to be able to control the whole process from extraction to transportation to distribution, so that all the Russians would be doing would be taking it out of the ground. Everything else would be done in a classic colonial style by the imperialist companies, principally, of course, the big oil and gas companies, BP, Shell, Texaco, Exxon, etc. And they effectively would turn Russia into a colonized nation. And they came very close to pulling this off. It didn't quite work out in the way that they wanted it to, though. So bear in mind also, and here we must jump back 70, 80, 90 years, to considering capitalism and its development in the pre-revolutionary Russia of the Tsardom. There, you, of course, had a very weak bourgeoisie, which was keen on being imperialist itself, but was also basically a tool and a puppet for principally British and French imperialism. Lenin analyzed this in his book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, where you could see that the domestic bourgeois in Russia were not only very weak in comparison to their European equivalents or their Western European equivalents, but they were also routinely reduced to the status of essentially being agents for, firstly, British and French imperialism, but also later German imperialism. It was like British and French capitalists who were investing in Russia. So Russia was a wannabe imperialist power. Certainly its bourgeoisie were very keen on it becoming one, but also it was a power that was sort of semi-colonized or semi-occupied power, even back then, due to the very, very weak nature of its bourgeoisie. And there is another factor in old Russia, of course, pre-revolutionary Russia, which is that the aristocracy and the Tsardom ran an earlier form of imperialism, which was based on the hyper-exploitation of the peripheral peasantry in the form of extracting rents from them. And that was true in places like Poland. It was true in certain places in Central Asia as well. So Russia pre-revolution was suffering in the same way from some of the same maladies that it was in its post-counter-revolutionary period in the 90s, which is that the imperialists sought to turn it into basically a system of vassalage. So it would be run by some corrupt sort of mafia-type operation. If you look at like the Aliyev crime family in Azerbaijan, essentially what they wanted, in the British and the Americans wanted in the 90s, was to have that relationship with Russia. And if they couldn't get that relationship, then they would break it down into more manageable parts, break up the country. Now, they were at this game even in the period where Yeltsin was in charge, because, of course, there was one of the reasons that motivated them to do so was, of course, there was going to be a pipeline running from the Caucasus through what is, of course, Chechnya, up into Russia. And they wanted to make sure that the Russian oil and gas industry didn't develop to the point where it could pose a threat to their interests. They wanted to cripple the Russian oil and gas industry as well, and make sure that it couldn't do anything much at all other than act as basically an agent to sell things to them. And they wanted to make sure that they had thorough control of the extraction of these resources, such as I said before. So what changes? Well, this plan doesn't quite work out for them, and it doesn't quite work out for them because of a number of reasons. First of all is, of course, the instability and weakness of the comprador bourgeoisie in Russia. They don't have a great deal of political presence. They have to have elections rigged for them. Yeltsin, of course, had to stage a coup. Well, first of all, he had to dissolve the Soviet Union in a separatist coup, which is what he did. That's what the Belovezhaya Forest Accords are in 1991. It's a coup orchestrated by Yeltsin, Sobchak, and the clown that ran Belarus at the time. And Yeltsin, Sobchak, Gaidar, the Russian ones. You got Kravchuk from Ukraine, and Sheikevich from Belarus, the other republic leader who signed the accords. Of course, none of the Central Asian countries were even consulted. That's essentially a coup staged by Yeltsin and others. And then you get another coup in '93, Black October. And then you get another, essentially a coup, which is a rigged election in '96, which everybody knows now that Zyuganov of the KPRF won, but essentially it was rigged by a combination of ballot stuffing and media manipulation and the active intervention of the British and American intelligence services. They even bragged about it on the cover of Time magazine. No, but this doesn't go right, though, for a couple of reasons. First of all, there is a catastrophic economic crash in 1997 to 1998. The Russian economy goes over the edge of a cliff. And, of course, this terminally damages not just the credibility of Yeltsin, but anybody associated with him. Yeltsin is compelled by the Russian Duma, even the relatively impotent Russian Duma after '93, still had some power. And it was able to compel Yeltsin to appoint a unity government headed by this old functionary from the later Soviet period, Primakov, and the KPRF held the finance ministry and another ministry. So this, of course, is something that the imperialists definitely don't want. They don't want the communists in any way back in power, but there they were. And the reason why Primakov had to bring them in was because he was slightly smarter than the people around Yeltsin, and he had a bit of a different agenda. He represented a sort of tendency within the old late period Soviet bureaucracy that was pro-capitalist but wanted to go in a national capitalist direction, not just a comprador direction. And he basically represents a sort of forerunner for what Putin would become. He was a rival to Putin for a little while. But the Primakov government in 1998 to 99, when it only lasted less than a year, but it lasted and did some significant things. It started the process of bringing back controls over the economy again, which had been all but abandoned by the Yeltsin group. It also, of course, during this time, you have the assault on Yugoslavia, and infamously, of course, or famously, Primakov turned his plane around over the Atlantic and went home again in protest against the American assault in Yugoslavia. Of course, this, motivated the comprador clique around Yeltsin to sack Primakov and dissolve his government, but this didn't solve anything for them. Yeltsin then had to, of course, bring in what he regarded as a solid fixer, which is in the form of Putin, to be prime minister, and the rest develops from there. Putin becomes president as essentially a compromise candidate because of the various different factions inside the power centers of late 90s Russia, which are, of course, the oligarchic compradors being one, that surrounded Yeltsin and his crime family. You then get below them certain more national-oriented capitalists, though not very many of them. You have the power of the armed forces, in which there is still very strong, what you would call pro-communist and also pro-Russian nationalist tendencies. And you have others who are interested in sort of early ideas of Eurasianism and other factions which are all chronicled in the work of Professor Richard Sakwa in his book, The Putin Paradox. But the fact is that there is basically a logjam and a crisis in the Russian state in 1999. You have the war in Chechnya starting up again, and of course the fact that MI6 and the CIA had been active there since the early 90s, of course, has never stopped. You also have basically a almost total implosion of Russian state authority. And you have a situation where it could have easily plunged into civil war had certain things not gone in the way that they did. So Putin is brought in as essentially the man who's going to be charged with the task of sorting out these various different factions at the top of the Russian state. And essentially what he does over the next few years is he develops his own authority from being this rather anonymous figure. He used to be an assistant to Sobchak. He develops an ability to manage these various different groups, and his coalition changes at various different times. Now, it's important to talk about the political basis for his rule, because it essentially operates as a form of progressive Bonapartism, in that what he does is that he starts to assert the state's authority again. First of all, over the most egregious examples of the compradors. So that's why Khodorkovsky goes to jail in 2004. Khodorkovsky was the chosen agent of US imperialism in Russia. What they wanted to do was to maneuver him into the presidency, and that he would be their chosen man to deliver what they wanted. Now, bear in mind what I said before about the way in which that the US and the British imperialists saw the development of Russia in the 90s. What they saw it as being was that they wanted to have a reliable, non-drunk comprador regime in charge, ideally some sort of oligarch. Khodorkovsky is exactly that guy. He's still that guy to this day, to be honest. He's floating around this apparent Russian government in exile that the US has got set up, and he was meant to be their guy, which is why, of course, Putin moved against him. UCOS was meant to be also their way in to getting what they wanted, which is, of course, ultimate control over the oil and gas industries. So this is why UCOS is broken up. Khodorkovsky is rightly jailed for things that he had done, which are tax offences. And then, of course, he goes into exile. And then you get sort of other famous examples, such as Putin stepping in and essentially ordering Oleg Deripaska to keep a factory open. That famous example happened on camera, where he sort of carpets and humiliates Deripaska. And then what he's doing there, of course, is he's enforcing the deal that he offered them in 2003, which is that, okay, we're not going to reverse any of the privatizations that took place in the 90s. We're not going to take your loot off you. You can continue looting, even, because that happened for a long time under Putin. But what you don't get to do is to compromise the integrity of the state and destabilize things. So this is his deal that he offers to the oligarchs back then. Now, of course, many of them, like Berezovsky and Khodorkovsky, immediately freaked out and declared that this was a return to tyranny. Many of them went into exile in their very luxurious London apartments, and people like Berezovsky ultimately die in exile in these apartments and houses that they built up with their loot in London. Now, during all of this time, of course, there is capital being exported out of Russia. Now, this is pointed out by many in the Trotskyite world, and indeed, when I was a Trotskyite, I didn't question this too much either, but you dive into what capital is being exported and where is it going in the 2000s, all the way from the early 2000s through to 2014-15. Where's all this shit going? Well, all this capital isn't going to be invested in foreign markets and colonized nations for the purposes of hyper-exploiting colonized peoples and subjugated peoples for their labor and resources. No, where it's going, this exported capital out of Russia is the oligarchs sending their money into tax havens, into the British Virgin Islands, into the Cayman Islands, into the Dutch Antilles, into or through the City of London, into investments in real estate in London and New York and Paris and Berlin. That's where it's going. So when people say, oh, well, Russia exports capital, yes, it does, or it did, in the 2000s and 2010s. But it was essentially capital flight out of the country, which the Putin government didn't stop because he was abiding by his deal with them, which is you can send your money around the world, but again, you don't get to compromise the integrity of the Russian state. So in that sense, yes, capital gets exported from Russia. but it's not capital that's being invested anywhere. It's capital it's loot that is being stashed in foreign bank accounts, being laundered into property, being laundered through the City of London. This is why Russian exiled oligarchs were so popular in Britain in the early 2000s, because first of all they were an ally to the British government against the evil Putin, because he'd stopped his emergence, and the system that he built stopped their plan to turn Russia into an appendage of the West. And of course, they brought a lot of capital with them, and they invested it in various different places, and they spread the money around London, thus, of course, making them very popular. So when we get to the point where we're discussing, like, well, capital is capital exported from Russia? Yes, it is. Now, it is invested. It is not invested, though. It's exported into, again, as I said, it's laundered into bank accounts, etc. So the other points about, well, is Russia imperialist? Let's then look at the relationship which the Russian state and the Russian ruling class have with places like Ukraine prior to 2014. Is it the case that the Russian oligarchy is ruthlessly exploiting Ukraine? Well, the answer is to that one. Although, of course, the Russian oligarchs did have interests in Ukraine, Ukraine is very much being exploited by domestic compradors. That's who's doing the exploiting in Ukraine. In fact, many of the compradors, like Poroshenko, former president of Ukraine, and of course former member of the Communist Party of Ukraine back in the day, along with many others who went on to join the comprador clique of capitalists in Ukraine post-91. Poroshenko had extensive business interests in Russia. Quite a few of the Ukrainian oligarchy did. I believe even Kolomoisky did at some stage. So, first of all, this isn't a colonizer-colonized dependency relationship, no matter what the Ukrainian compradors say now. This was a relationship through the very extensive trading links that were built between the newly independent Ukraine and the newly separated Russia, but there was no hyper-exploitation of Ukrainian labor purely by Russian oligarchs. Russia wasn't colonizing Ukraine at all, and neither did the Soviet Union, by the way. These are all absurd claims made by, like, Banderists, etc. Ukraine was heavily invested in and built up under the Soviet Union, and was easily one of the most industrialized sections of it, and the Ukrainian oligarchy flushed it all down the bog so they could do what? Loot it, asset strip it, and destroy it, which is what they did. There was never a Putin moment where things were preserved there. So the idea that Russia is looking to take over Ukraine because it is exporting capital to Ukraine and exploiting Ukrainian resources and labor, this is a very shaky argument at best. And also, the Bonapartist regime in Russia showed no desire to actually act and take over Ukraine. They showed no desire to do so when there was the coup that was marketed as being specifically anti-Russian in the form of the so-called Orange Revolution of 2003. That wasn't Putin showed no interest in acting militarily then at all, even though, of course, it was a coup. The Yanukovych won that election, and the agents of the British, the Americans, and the Canadians, and others acted to create a fake movement and then essentially force a rerun of the election that they shouldn't have been entitled to. Of course, all done with the collaboration of that horrendous crook who ran Ukraine both in front of and behind the scenes for many years, Leonid Kuchma. And of course, Putin, being a representative of the Russian government, as he is the head of the Russian government, makes nice with the man who inherited, or the man who was the beneficiary of the coup in 2003, which is Yushchenko. And so this didn't lead to an invasion. It didn't lead to a total collapse in relations even between Russia and Ukraine. Let's look at 2014. Even after that, with the Donbass rebellion led by the workers of Donbass, does Putin take advantage, swoop in, take all of Ukraine? No. He had no an interest in doing that, or he and the system that he heads had no interest in doing that. Why? Well, for a number of reasons, and this relates back to Russia not being an imperialist country. Russia's primary exports through the 2000s and up to 2014 remained, of course, oil and gas, principally, though not exclusively, to the European nations, some of which, of course, transits through Ukraine. Some of which transits through Ukraine, I think, to this day. Some of it, anyway. I think they only just stopped paying Ukraine transit fees. So the Russian system built by Putin is still at this stage built on the idea of we're selling oil and gas to the Europeans. This is a very profitable enterprise. And Putin, I think Putin personally, believed that this was a path to secure a long-term alliance between Russia and the European countries, and even perhaps with the US itself, or to reach some sort of compromise with the United States. And this, of course, he is, of course, proven tragically wrong. But the reason why, of course, that they had no interest really in taking over Ukraine in 2014, or even doing so with Georgia in 2008, is because the action in Georgia, which we've referred to a number of times as being the initial model for what Putin and the Russian government did in Ukraine in 2022, this military action was taken basically to do the bare minimum to essentially warn the United States off trying to stick Georgia into NATO. And of course, to respond to the idiot Saakashvili's attempt to invade South Ossetia, which of course the Russians weren't going to allow. And ultimately it caused the collapse of the Saakashvili regime, which had been brought in a few years earlier during another colour revolution referred to as the Rose Revolution. But an imperialist power, when confronted with the opportunities that the Russians had in the early 2000s and the late 2000s in Ukraine and Georgia, if they were into securing domination over the resources of Ukraine and Georgia, could have gone a lot further than they did. But of course that would have damaged their ability to sell their oil and gas in Europe in particular, that have got hit with the sanctions years earlier. So this isn't a bourgeoisie even that's particularly interested or able to engage in the process of export of capital at the time. It's a parasitic bourgeoisie, a bourgeoisie that gets to the stage where it is imperialist, has gone through several different stages of development of the productive forces internally, to the point where it can't make profits anymore, sufficient profit anymore, by investing internally, and therefore takes its capital and exports it elsewhere. But the Russian bourgeois, because they come into existence or flash back into existence at a time when capitalism as a progressive force has been long finished, they just emerge as a completely parasitic and completely useless class. They're incapable of driving forward development in Russia. They're incapable of doing anything other than soaking up capital and grabbing capital, asset stripping things, and sending that capital overseas. That's all they're capable of doing. All the private owners of the oil and gas companies that do still exist in Russia are just interested in flogging it and barely even investing anything. Now, what happens, especially after 2014, is that there is another evolution of the Russian state and economy, as chronicled by the English scholar Richard Connolly in his book on the Russian economy post the sanctions regime of 2014. What happens then is, of course, that Russia prior to that, 2000 to 2014, or certainly 2000 to 2008, there's some changes between 2008 and 2014, but certainly in the first period, Putin and his system is interested in, or are interested in, securing the remit of the Russian state, crushing the Chechen revolt, which they effectively have ended by 2008. There is still some terroristic activity, but they've effectively won that one by the end of the decade, at significant cost in lives and in blood and treasure, to use the old phrase. But then you get the crash of 2008, and of course the sort of more typically liberal period in Russia, liberal in terms of the economic outlook, ends in 2008, and you start to see transition towards what's now taking place, which is the state-led development. By 2014, the debates within the Russian ruling circle have clearly moved against the more liberal types. Putin's gone through an awful lot of prime ministers in his time, but you can see in the early period, because he still has this the oligarchs in the tent, or several of them in the big tent, shall we say, their political representatives still played a high-profile role. I mean, in his early years, Putin was introducing things like a flat tax, which is sort of libertarian's wet dream. And he had a lot of liberals in his cabinet and as prime minister. And it's only really later on that starts to go away again. And it particularly starts to change after he comes back following the Medvedev presidency. Now, Medvedev is always regarded as some sort of liberal, but I'm not sure that's entirely accurate. Both he and Putin have always worked as part of one team. And what he represented was just the line that the collective group at the top of the Russian state had taken at the time, which is that they were going to ward off the US from encroaching into Georgia. That they thought they'd solved things in Ukraine by essentially making nice with Yushchenko, and the aggressiveness of the US imperialists continually took them by surprise. They representing, of course, the fact that they wished to build a trading partnership with the US imperialists and thought that there was no reason for them to be hostile to each other, because, of course, these people all came out of the late period Soviet bureaucracy, which, of course, had no understanding of US imperialism or indeed any imperialism at all. But they are kicked in the nuts repeatedly by the US imperialists, and therefore, of course, have to develop an understanding or perish. And so you then move into a model of state-led development in Russia, particularly intensifying after 2014 with the Russian takeover in Crimea, which is motivated by security concerns, and of course is the Russian state responding to the recommendations of its military. Now, there were, of course, a lot of people inside the Putin system, the compradors that were still represented within the Putin system, screamed and cried blue murder at this and didn't want anything to do with it. But, of course, it proved very popular, both within Crimea itself and, of course, within wider Russia. And the sanctions that Obama started bringing in, of course, forces then the Putin system to adapt. And they then have to move to actually redeveloping the domestic economy again. Prior to that, of course, any growth had been driven by the export of oil and gas. And you start to see a couple of things happening. First of all, the state starts exerting more and more control over the banking system. You have large banks in Russia, but you used to have a whole lot more. And one of the things that Nabulina has done, the woman who's frequently condemned as sort of a representative of Russian liberalism, but one of the things that's been done during her tenure at the Russian National Bank is, of course, a rationalization of the Russian banking sector, which in the 90s was essentially just used as a money laundering and piggy bank system by the oligarchs. So you get a lot of Russian banks closed down and rationalized, and you get a more firm state control being exerted over a lot of these banks. You start to see the revenues from the now increasingly state-run or state-directed oil and gas industries being turned into inward investment. So inward investment into the supply chain for the oil and gas industries. And remember what I said about the imperialists wanting the oil and gas industries to be completely dependent upon them? Well, the compradors obliged them in the 90s by essentially destroying the supply chain for them. So that Russia, this great, this nation that has such a great repository of oil and gas, could no longer produce even the machines required to extract it. The replacement of the extraction machinery. A lot of this in the 90s was supplied by like BP, Shell, Texaco, Exxon, Mobil, and the others that had interest in Russia. So they had to essentially rebuild a lot of this, the machinery that was used in the extraction of oil and gas. And this was done, of course, through the state-run Gazprom, a very profitable state company. But they started expanding what Gazprom did all the way through the 2000s, and especially after 2014. And then the state started actually taking a much more active role in rebuilding Russian industry. And that has intensified as time has gone on. Obama, Trump, and Biden are essentially the fathers unwitting fathers perhaps, of a new semi-planned economy in Russia. And this has been necessitated by the fact that, again, Putin, who is essentially still a Russian liberal, has been confronted by the fact that he's had to reckon with the complete inability of the Russian capitalist class, with whom he was allied for a long time back in the 90s and his early period in office, to a certain extent. He's been confronted with their complete unwillingness to invest and their complete inability to effectively develop the major sectors of the economy that they need. So the economic development that takes place after 2014 sees the recreation of the Russian agricultural sector to replace the import-heavy agricultural policy of the 90s and 2000s. And then you get the other things that you survive the 90s, the other industries. So, for instance, you have the big military industrial concerns that are now producing gigantic amounts of military equipment for the special military operation. You have the state-run Rosatom, which runs the Russian nuclear industry. You have the various different industrial concerns which remained state-run all the way through the 90s, even though, of course, Yeltsin was selling everything that wasn't nailed down. He didn't manage to get to privatizing like the massive tank production plants at like places like Uralvagonzavod. So these were retooled into bigger, you got a series of mergers of industrial concerns in the late 90s into these very big state-run industries. Some of them are wholly state-owned, some of them are state-directed, but as Connolly chronicles in his work, these are mostly like state-run industries that produce according to the demands of the Russian state, which is why they've been able to effectively now outstrip European and American military industrial production, because they've built over the last, or rebuilt I should say, over the last 10 years a very effective military industrial capacity. That, and of course the fact that they've rebuilt their supply chains inside Russia to mainly be dependent upon raw materials and manufactured parts that are either built in Russia or extracted and built in Russia, and anything else they don't have the capacity to build as of now, they've been buying in, especially from China. So what does this tell us about? Let's revisit now the argument over the over Russia being imperialist. Does the rationalization of the banking system, does the merger of these various different state-owned companies into bigger state-owned industrial concerns, does all of this represent a move to imperialism? The answer to that is no, because what is going on isn't the process by which the imperialism manifested itself the first time round, which is, of course, the merger of money and industrial capital into finance capital. Now, why is that done? That is done in order that it can be more effectively exported overseas. Again, Russian capital exports are still very, very low. The principal actual export of Russia still remains, of course, oil, gas, and of course now wheat to other places, there were other countries. So this industrial regeneration, the increasing role that the state takes in the development or redevelopment of areas of the economy that have been destroyed by the Yeltsin period. So, for instance, the rebuilding of the Russian aircraft industry, the still Soviet aircraft industry, built all these very, very effective aircraft in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, but all got severely damaged or destroyed by the Yeltsin experiments of the 90s. And even Putin himself commented that when he was in that 4-year stint as prime minister, they essentially managed to destroy what was left of the Russian domestic airliner production industry by opening it up to foreign competition. So it was only after the repeated waves and waves of sanctions that they managed to essentially use those to their advantage, which is that they created a protectionist system with the aid of the US imperialists. To drive foreign competition was driven out, and the Russian state is compelled to invest in the regeneration of industries that had been killed off in the 90s and the 2000s. Now you're seeing Russian domestic aircraft production for civilian purposes pick up again, and you're also seeing Russian shipbuilding significantly increase. So they're increasing their production of massive icebreakers for the northern trade routes through the Arctic sea ice, and they're rebuilding the Russian Navy in a way that hadn't been done for many years, moving away from their reliance on the late period Soviet ships, which had been kept in service for an awful long time. A lot of this is, of course, based on the old industrial investments of the Soviet Union, which they're now starting to expand upon. Again, though, this hasn't been done by the Russian capitalist class. This has all been driven by the Russian state redeploying its resources internally. Yes, the level of investment from Russian capitalist class has increased, essentially because it's been left with no other option. It's been battered into basically having very few choices other than to invest internally, other than those who are, of course, determined to be compradors and therefore completely sell out to the West and continue to run to London and Paris, where they're viewed with suspicion now. So none of this fits in with Russia being an imperialist power. It just doesn't. Then you add on to the fact that, well, what is the Russian Federation as it currently stands doing vis-a-vis areas of the world that had been colonized by the imperialist powers? And the answer is that in places like the Sahel, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Central African Republic, they've been playing a relatively progressive role in terms of assisting those places to assert their independence away from the Western colonial powers. They've played a relatively progressive role in providing some support to the Cuban government and, of course, in Venezuela as well. So none of this smacks of a country which is going down the route of imperialism. And as we've covered many times before, the Putin government was prepared to accept a very minimal outcome in Ukraine. If we're going back to there as an example of awful Russian imperialism, they were prepared to accept the minimum, which was the independence of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, that they were going to hold on to Crimea and that would be it. Now, of course, you could argue that they knew very well that that would be it for the Kiev regime if it signed such an agreement, but that was what they were prepared to actually sign on the line for. Doesn't exactly say a lot about them being aggressive imperialists. What's happened is the more maximal objectives have been compelled, not by the Russians themselves, but by the way in which that the Ukrainian puppet regime has been manipulated by US imperialism. So on every level, let's just run through things again. You don't have the merger of money and industrial capital in the same way to form finance capital as happened with all of the imperialist powers. You don't have the massive capital investments outside of the homeland as you did with all of the imperialist powers, especially Britain, France, and the United States. And you have a capitalist class which didn't develop to the point where it could no longer make profit internally. You have a capitalist class which was brought back into existence too late to be in any way progressive and remains completely degenerate to this day. The growth that's being done now, the growth that's being driven in Russia is state-developed growth. And you have a growth rate now probably going to be approaching 3%. Now, that's all because of the fact that the Russian capitalist class has basically been put under the boot heel of the state, and the state has taken the lead in all of these investments, which is why you can say that the Putin system, for all its myriad of contradictions and drawbacks, has in the end played a progressive role of re-establishing Russian state sovereignty, ending the attempts to turn Russia into a neo-colony of the United States and Britain, and being able to emerge as a strong industrial power again. Again, there's still a lot of contradictions there. It's still based fundamentally on now a state-driven capitalist system, and ultimately this is a transitional system that will have to move in the direction of socialism if any of its actual achievements that it has managed to bring about are to be preserved and extended. You can't go much further with this rotten and still completely corroded and useless Russian capitalist class. But it is not an imperialist power. To say it is essentially to render the term imperialism completely without any meaning. It's to empty not just the work of Lenin, but the work of Stalin, Mao, Kwame Nkrumah, Samir Amin and others, of all of its meaning, and to just basically say, well, Russia's taken this land, therefore Russia must be imperialist. It's a non-scientific analysis worthy only of a Trotskyite. Right, let's catch up with the chat, but let's also take some tea in. Okay, let's see where we've got to so far. We have Yuan, who says, hello to Alex and all comrades from Phoenix, Arizona. Well, good evening to you. And Oz, do you think the US is now in a position the UK found itself in 1850? I think the US was in that position from about 1965 onwards. We're a long way into its decline now. Its decline is only going to speed up now. Comrade Muzzle Paint says, Comrade Solidarity, Alex, you are the intellectual lighthouse in the Imperial Night. Wow. That's praise indeed. Thank you very much. Big Meanie says, what do you say to Eastern Europeans such as Poles who say that the Russia was and is imperialist and the invasion of Ukraine is... Okay, Big Meanie says, currently many Poles hold up Ukraine as an example of Russian imperialism. Well, they're wrong for all the reasons I've just outlined. So I won't reiterate the point. But the Poles are suffering from imperialism themselves. They're essentially been reduced to a vassal state of the US empire. They are an occupied nation. They have massive US bases there. Their government is essentially run by a combination of decisions made in Berlin, Brussels, and Washington. So, yeah, Poland is a victim of imperialism. It's a victim of US imperialism. And its own comprador bourgeoisie put it there. Otis, good evening to you. And Marko Vucevic says, Germans were in Qingdao. With reference to where the Germans were in China. Thank you very much. Conrad's Heart of Darkness says Muzzle Paint in reference to the role of the Belgians. Oz says, don't forget Mr. Rhodes himself, often a forgotten figure from the colonial golden age. I haven't forgotten Cecil Rhodes. He was the man who actually said that imperialism was necessary in order to buy off enough of the domestic working class to ensure stability. He was a man who was a bastard, but he was a clever bastard. Okay, Sammy makes the right point. The Poles and Eastern Europeans are indeed suffering from imperialism of the US and the EU, who are steadily destroying their progress they made, exploiting their shattered dreams. Very well put. Jenny says it's cringe when leftoids say Russia is imperialist. Yeah, notice that they never make arguments. I mean, I've just spent an hour making an argument as to why Russia isn't imperialist. I bet if you got a Trotskyite on here, he'd probably just start screaming and keep saying over and over again, but they've invaded Ukraine, without actually analysing the situation at all. It's basically just reducing imperialism to being a naughty word. Like their usage of the term has no actual content to it. It's just like something that they throw around. Like they throw the term fascist around, but they've never seriously done an investigation into what fascism actually is. Again, it's pathetic, like sub-student level politics. Sami says, a perfect description of the mechanics of Samir Amin's centre and periphery countries created by global capitalism. Yes, everybody should read Samir Amin's work. Yes, Jenny, Bill Browder had his tap turned off. Yeah, that guy's a scumbag, absolute crook. He should be in prison in Russia. In fact, one of the first things we should do, depending upon where that bastard is now, is we should hand him back over to the Russians after the revolution. Same level of details about China, asks Frank. Well, I'll have to do a whole new program on that, but I'm happy to take it on. Oligarchs are still mad. That's very true. Putin is going to get re-elected. Yeah, he'll get at least 70% of the vote. Very much so. And Ash says, during my Trotskyist years, I never heard the word comprador being used. Only heard it in the last few years during my journey towards Marxism-Leninism. Did you have a similar experience? Yeah, they never talked about comprador bourgeois because I was in the Socialist Party of England and Wales, or SPEW for short. Imperialism was never really investigated in a serious way. And also the idea of the comprador bourgeoisie isn't just an insult that we use. It's a very real phenomenon which you can scientifically identify and identify its trends and who they are and what their actions are. And once you identify the fact that the bourgeoisie in Russia in the 90s were complete compradors, you can start to analyze why and start to analyze, like, well, what were they doing? What was the purpose there? Like, all this information that I've been talking about this evening, which was, of course, gathered from a variety of sources, no Trotskyite ever bothered to do any kind of research on that. All the stuff we were given about Russia was that it was imperialist, but they never said how, or that it represented imperialist gangster capitalism. Basically, I think that their research was done by watching the 1990s Hollywood movies. So basically that Russia was run by the bad guy from Val Kilmer's version of The Saint, if anybody can recall watching that. No, but Trotskyites never do serious investigations of imperialism, because then you would be forced into asking, well, why do they keep siding with it? Like, I've told this story many times, but I remember being sent out to hand out anti-Gaddafi leaflets, which were typical of the Trotskyite group I was in, because they would agree with imperialism on every point, but then say, but imperialism shouldn't invade. And that's what they were doing with the Libyan scandal. This is what they did with Syria as well. They kept going on, Assad must go, but well, we don't want imperialists to do it. Well, who else is going to do it, given that they're the ones organising the so-called revolt against him? Chad Moment, says Jenny, in reference to Putin taking down Deripaska, and Jenny is correct. Beju says, I think many people who understand that their wealth is related to colonial exploitation will secretly agree to the continuation of this relationship in fear of losing their current material condition. How do you convince them to fight against this? Well, it's a very good question, and I think that the point is to recall what Lenin said about going further and deeper into the masses. There are a certain layer, and it's a smaller layer now, due to the fact that British imperialism is less and less able to exploit its old markets. It's a smaller layer now within the working class who directly benefit from imperialism. So that's the one thing to say. The other thing to say is that we as communists must organise in those layers of the working class who don't benefit from it and are, in fact, subjugated or are unable to find themselves represented within the labour movement, which is dominated by the labour aristocracy. So we must go further and deeper into the masses in Britain, the great masses who do not benefit from imperialism and are in fact victims of it in their own way, because they are victims of the country being asset stripped. Now, and this, by the way, goes back to Trotskyism and social democracy as well. Trotskyism in Britain is just an adjunct of social democracy, and social democracy in imperialist countries is a movement of the labour aristocracy, those layers that benefit from imperialism. And Trotskyism just exists and floats around the various different elements of the labour movement, and the labour movement basically is dominated by the labour aristocracy. So it's no wonder they don't want to interrogate imperialism, because their whole agenda is to gain influence within the labour aristocracy, who are the direct beneficiaries of imperialism. So our journey as communists, to answer Beju's question, takes us deeper into the masses who aren't the beneficiaries of it. A more difficult thing to do, because these are often the masses that are unorganised and outside of the traditional labour and trade union movement. But is there that the forces exist that can be mobilised against the system. And once you mobilise that, then you'll see a split in labour aristocracy. Some will go over to fascism and counter-revolution. Others will see the movement of the great masses of Britain or France or the United States and will join with them, because they see a communist-led mass movement of the working class will represent a positive vision of the future. And even some of the labour aristocracy and a significant chunk of the petty bourgeois will come on board with that. Not all of them, but enough of them to build our forces further. Right, Oz says, in hindsight, Putin's deal has backfired twice. The first being the main opponents of Russia now hold this capital, and secondly, how that money, if seized, will implode the international financial system. Yeah, I mean, the fact that they left all that money overseas, and the fact that they left some of the Russian central bank reserves overseas, was a serious error. But if the imperialists fully pull the trigger on that. And at the moment, what they're doing is they're saying they're going to use the Russian assets to essentially rack up debt and borrow against them, and then send the money that they've borrowed to Ukraine. And then they can argue that they've not stolen it, and then they'll try and get the Russians to pay the bill on the for the borrowing they've done against the Russian assets, which of course the Russians won't pay. So in the end, they're going to end up imploding things regardless. So yes, there's been significant downsides to the deals that Putin has done, and we should never, by the way, go down the route of assuming that the Putin system is some sort of final product. It is a transitional regime. It will need to move in the direction of socialism, which of course it can't do bureaucratically. That only comes from a reanimation, a reintegration of the Russian masses into the process of history, into being the agents of history again. So, Slava, hello to you, says Western capitalists also exploit Ukrainians. Yeah, in a major way. Just look at the amount of assets of Ukraine that Zelensky and his miserable gang have sold to the likes of BlackRock and the Vanguard Group, and people before Zelensky as well. Poroshenko, Yushchenko, all did deals with major imperialist corporations to flog off bits of Ukrainian, the Ukrainian economy, including significant amounts of Ukrainian fertile land and Ukrainian industries. So Ukraine has been exploited by the imperialists for many, many years now, far more than it was ever exploited by the Russian oligarchy even. So, Big Meaning, glad you found something useful in the answer there. Where are we now? Okay. Sammy says, it seems the ripples through history of the Soviet Revolution will zigzag onwards for many decades. The Russian rejection of becoming another vassal state owes to its Soviet past. Geopolitics shifts. Yes, it does indeed. And we'll have to see where that develops next. But you're right to say that the ripples of the 1917 continue, whether the current rulers of Russia like it or not. Thanks, Obama. Yes, Obama, the founder of the modern Russian state-managed capitalist system. Good evening to Guy Schroer. And Fenrir says Rostec. That's right. That's one of the big state-owned enterprises there. Ian Foster, good evening to you, says imperialists managed to promote in Russia what they fear the most, independent economic development outside of their core economic order. Yep. Obama and co. really managed to pull off a great legacy there. Yes, and leftists never say how and why Russia is imperialist. Ben says, relatively productive and stable economic situation created by the Bonapartist state is still a market economy. Won't it now build a proper capitalist economy, barring revolution, still not imperialist? Well, this is an interesting point that we need to develop further. It's still a capitalist economy, even if it's a state-led one. The uselessness and impotence of the Russian capitalist class is an interesting point, and whether they will become any better. But yes, Ben's completely correct, which is it's not a socialist system, and also it's still trying to prop up a capitalist system which is fundamentally finished as a progressive force. So it will need to develop to actually solidify the gains that it has made. It will need to essentially finish the process of expropriating the Russian capitalist class and moving back to socialism again, or a new version of socialism in Russia. That's why I say the Putin system is a temporary system. Battle Cossack says Carlos Menem in Argentina was light Yeltsin. Javier Milei is like an even worse version of Yeltsin. Yeah, we'll come to Milei tomorrow. Harry Price says, Putin a liberal or a non-ideological political scientist using proven successful economic systems that work for everyone, not the 1%. Putin, in his outlook, remains I would call him a national liberal, basically. He has shown himself to be, he was very much part of the liberal sphere in the 90s. I think he's changed quite a lot over the years. I mean, bear in mind, liberals back in the middle part of the 20th century in the West weren't averse to large amounts of state intervention in the economy. Russian liberals have developed some Russian liberals, I should say, have developed in that direction. So I'd say that he still is basically a Russian liberal, but a Russian liberal reflects the Russian characteristics. And as for the systems that work for everyone, well, I'd say it's a system that works for more people than the fucking Yeltsin system was ever going to, but you've still got significant problems in Russia, as the KPRF are frequently commenting on. Muzzle Paint says, I remember Russian gangster capitalism being bantered around in the 90s, absolutely. Yeah. Again, no, it was a bastardization and a cheap jibe. It was never based on a serious analysis of what was going on in Russia, because nobody was interested in doing that analysis in the West. A lot of these guys know or should know Lenin's definition of imperialism, yet they still say such nonsense. I don't think they do. I mean, I'm speaking from personal experience. I didn't understand Lenin's imperialism until I junked my former allegiance to Trotskyism. And I read it again in the light of actually understanding Soviet history, and then I got it. I didn't understand it the first few times I read it. Harry, glad you like the show. Gangster capitalism sounds like something Cornel West would say. Wouldn't be surprised if the Trots go for him. Got it for him. Yes, the Cornel West campaign. Maybe we have to do a live stream on that. It seems to be an absolute car crash. Yeah, I remember. No, actually, West has done this in one of his sort of jazzman routines. He's gone on about how Trump's a gangster, Putin's a gangster, etc., etc. I don't know if we called Biden a gangster in one of his sort of freestyles, for academic freestyling. Jesus. Isn't all capitalism gangster? No, that makes it sound too cool. Capitalism is capitalism. You don't need any additional words to make it any more horrifying than it is. It's like you don't need additional words to make. If you know the history of imperialism and all its brutish horror, you don't need to stick additional terms on it to make it horrifying. You know, the reality is quite horrifying enough. We have work to do, says Ian Foster. We do indeed. Fenrir Wolf, I should say, says the only thing that differs from one gangster to another is the level that they disguise their intentions. The goal stays the same. The Harry says the flat rate of tax with reference to the flat tax stepping stone better than no tax at all. Compromise, I would say, Harry, to answer your point there. It's a compromise that Putin offered to them. It's like pay some tax rather than no tax, and it's very much his method, which is to restore the integrity of the Russian state via essentially getting a compromise out of the compradors, and that's what he did with that. So yes, you can make that. It's a perfectly valid argument to say that. I mean, the Putin system has shown itself to be, at each turn, he gives them a chance. He's given them a chance to actually invest in the country, to mend their ways, and they never have. You know, that's why he was forced to say in a speech last November that capitalism as a system was finished. But I've yet to see where that's evolving to in terms of his plans, because the Russian capitalist class are just absolutely fucking awful. I mean, but they couldn't be any other way, because again, they've been brought into existence. They were crap the first time round, came too late to the party then. Second time round, from the 90s onwards, they're just as awful. They are products of a system which is finished. Biden, the milquetoast neoliberal. Yes, it's such a... That is the big American leftist thing, isn't it? It's the... They keep saying that, Biden's a coward, the Democrats are cowards. No, not at all. Biden is as much of a vicious imperialist swine as any Republican president has been. In fact, Biden's been an out there and open and honest swine for his entire life. So to say that he's milquetoast is ridiculous. He's been a rapacious villain for his entire career. He's been a dedicated servant of American imperialism overseas, and of course the rent seekers and the money lenders at home, in the form of the credit card industry. So he's not milquetoast. I mean, it's basically this classic American leftist argument that if only the Democrats would really mean what they said, well, they do mean what they say in terms of being dedicated servants of the American ruling class and being prepared to basically, annihilate the American working class on behalf of the most parasitic elements of American capitalism. That's Biden's entire career. So Cornel West is just covering for Biden by saying that. And of course, if he would actually tell the truth about Biden, which I think West is smart enough to know the truth about Biden, then he wouldn't get invited to the cocktail circuit anymore. People wouldn't want to buy his jazz albums. Right. Muzzle Paint says, absolutely, a Cornel West live stream. Look at his personal wealth versus his massive failed child support payments as he sells democratic socialism. Boy, that'd be something. Here in Brazil, says Guy Schrer, we already have neoliberals endorsing Milei. Yeah, well, they kind of had a misfire with Bolsonaro in Brazil, didn't they? He turned out to be not exactly what they were looking for. So a Milei figure would be their next move, because there's a big, I'm sure you as a Brazilian will know this better than I do, of course, but there is a big comprador section in Brazil that would happily reduce the nation to the status of an American colony, just as this is what Milei is doing. Milei is essentially, just as, Battle Cossack, who's in Argentina, mentioned earlier in the chat that Carlos Menem was a Yeltsin figure. The Menem legacy was only fully observable when things just collapsed in Argentina in the early 2000s. And Milei is doing the same thing. But also it points to the fact that the Argentine left turned, and particularly the Argentine left that came into power after the 2001 overthrow of Fernando de la Rua, the Kirchners, etc. They all, the Peronists, all failed in what they were doing. There was some temporary successes, but they largely were unable to overturn the power of the comprador bourgeoisie in Argentina, who, as Hudson correctly observes, own an awful lot of the Argentine debt. They've bought a lot of it up, along with the vulture funds headed by Paul Singer in the United States. So for somewhere like Argentina, the gun to their head is being held by their own ruling class. And until they expropriate that ruling class and remove their power to destroy the country, then Argentina is going to have severe problems. And it's not just the imperialists, it's their domestic agents that need to be disempowered. And you only do that, really, in the end, by expropriating them. The Russians have been helped in that by Biden, Obama, and Trump, essentially putting capital controls on Russia that Putin and Medvedev never did. It's shock worker of communist labor badge. No, the badge I'm wearing here, this is a Lenin badge from 1968. Bought it off a CPGBML stall about 7 years ago, before I even joined the party. Frank says, my Trotskyist friend in London who runs the Jedal TV said Putin was a thief in 2000. Please help me defend Putin in my next argument with him. Well, I would say, Putin, as I have said before, for whatever criticisms one can make, and I can make a lot of him, politically speaking, and of the way he has done things, or whether his system has done things. It's a collective entity. Look, if Putin was just a thief, he had ample opportunity to just make off with billions in the 90s. He was a lawyer. He was an associate of a real thief in Sobchak, and he was involved in small ways in the middle period of the Yeltsin administration. He was involved in the sale of state assets in Leningrad. He had the opportunity to extract a ton of money for himself, a lot. And he could have just taken everything, stolen everything, and walked off with it. He could have really, after his second term, just walked off into private business and stole as much as possible. The Americans, I think, and the British would have certainly enabled him to walk around thieving as much as possible. So if he was a simple thief and a comprador, then the imperialists would have had no problem with it. If he had been prepared to act as the Aliyev crime family does in Azerbaijan. If he'd have been prepared to essentially turn over the Russian oil and gas industry to the British and the Americans, and if he'd have been prepared to do that, he'd have been subject to a gigantic payoff. He'd be as rich as the Aliyev family are, or the Yeltsin family were. So again, like whatever else motivates the man, it isn't money, clearly. And we can observe that just by his his life and his actions. So saying that, oh, Putin is a thief, Putin's done this, that, the other, repeating Navalny's stuff, like, it's whatever benefit he's gained or whatever he's after, it certainly isn't cash. Again, if the man's had loads of opportunities to steal and run off with the proceeds, then he's clearly in this for some other reason, not money. Okay. Whatever else you think of Putin, he cares about his country. Yeah, like you can't argue with that, I don't think. Like he has a vision himself, I think, of what he wants Russia to be. I don't necessarily agree with it, but it's not one that accords with what the imperialists wanted, and it's not one that accords with what the domestic compradors wanted, and it's one that he's evolved over time. So yeah, you can't just say, oh, he's a thief, he's a gangster and all that. No. He's many things, but that's not what he's about, I don't think. No, it's not that I don't think. I know. It's not a matter of opinion. If what Navalny said was correct, then again, they'd have no problem with him. Think of the money he could have made from if he came in 2000 and essentially acted as the sober Yeltsin that they wanted. If he'd have turned over the Russian oil and gas industry to them completely, and this, by the way, was the subject of his complaint, or one of his complaints at the 2007 Munich conference, in his famous speech in front of McCain and Lieberman, he was basically saying to them, look, we are prepared to sell you on the market at fair prices Russian oil and gas, but do not attempt to muscle in and try and control the extraction of Russian oil and gas. Go back and watch the speech. He says that to them. We are going to control our resources. And McCain and Lieberman are sort of sneering away in the front row. Well, one of them is dead, and I don't know where Lieberman is these days. Probably screaming for a bomb attack on Iran. But this was essentially his complaint back then, that they were attempting, and had attempted over many years, to totally control the Russian oil and gas industry in a way that they totally control the Azerbaijani one. So again, like if he'd have done what Aliyev has done, which is basically pocket the cash and sit there as a sort of crime lord running a country for many, many years, periodically repressing people internally, and then finding ways to periodically engage in a sort of military suppression campaign as if he was an old school czar internally, that would be perfect for the US and the British. But he wasn't prepared to do any of that. Again, Putin is an interesting figure. In that it will be very interesting to see what the final biography on him will read like. But again, to say he's motivated by money, I don't think is true. It's just simply not the case. That he's some sort of thief. Slava says, Putin is actually a very shy introvert. People who met him in person say. Well, he's a very quiet and restrained man, if anything else. He's not a sort of flaming demagogic figure. Like Yeltsin was a demagogue. If you look back at Yeltsin when he was sober, he used to give these demagogic speeches promising all kinds of things when he was pretending to be a social democrat at the end of the 80s, trying to get the miners of Donbass on his side, actually. He'd go down there, and Yeltsin was a very good agitator. Ironically enough, a talent that had been developed in him by the CPSU. So Yeltsin could do the thing where he was like this big guy slamming the table, giving these flaming over-the-top speeches. Yeltsin was good at that. Gorbachev was good at that. Gorbachev was a good talker. Fuck all good at anything else other than, collapsing the country. So it might also be a bit of a reaction. Partly his personality, but also a reaction to the two men who came before him as the leaders of the Soviet Union and Russia were these sort of over-the-top blabbermouths. So his sort of restrained personality might be a bit of a reaction to that. He also bristles whenever anybody compares him to Khrushchev, but I can't quite blame him on that one. So yes, it's an interesting observation. He's clearly uncomfortable doing agitational speaking. If you observe him when he had to do this sort of agitational speech when the regions of former Ukraine, Zaporozhye, Kherson, Lugansk and Donetsk, voted to join the Russian Federation, and he's at that mass rally, he's clearly uncomfortable doing the sort of rabble-rousing speaking. He's not very good at it. Whereas a sort of Yeltsin figure would be, probably screaming out quotations from Dostoevsky and necking a bottle of vodka. Right. Okay. We are going to draw it to a close here tonight for this evening. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in. It's been, again, a very interesting discussion in the chat. I am making notes that we need to do stuff on Millet, on China, and on the Cornel West presidential campaign. Maybe we'll keep that one for Friday. Maybe that one will come with alcohol. Who knows? So, thank you to everybody who's contributed tonight, and I will be back again with you tomorrow.
Oh, Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the forgeman he has been, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.